This conference will now be recorded.
This is Unit VCS01, Lesson 1. Today we are covering Learning Outcome 1, Relevant Pieces of Legislation. Assessment Criteria 1.A. Describe key pieces of current legislation relevant to veterinary practice. Legislation is going to be very key to yourself, not only at this point in your training as a Level 2 student, it will also continue as you progress further with your training if you wish to do so upon completing your Level 3 Diploma for Veterinary Nursing, but also when you're a qualified RVN and vitally as a team member in veterinary practice. It's really important, and the aim of today's lesson is to ensure that you have a basic understanding of how legislations affect veterinary practice staff, clients, the animals that we are caring for. Ultimately, their welfare is paramount, and that is the reason behind this legislation. And also how we practically apply it to veterinary practice and your role. The pieces of legislation that we're going to be covering today are as follows. The Veterinary Surgeons Act 1966. This is an overarching piece of legislation that you need to be very aware of throughout your time in veterinary practice. It has been written for veterinary surgeons, but also dictates to other members of the team and non-veterinary staff what people are allowed or not allowed to do. It also, of course, considers animal welfare at the heart of all of that. The Animal Welfare Act 2006 came about because we needed changes to that act to make things clearer, place a duty of care onto owners or carers of animals. We have also seen some changes to that act in 2018 in relation to dog breeding, and that is something that we'll cover later on for you to have some further knowledge about as well. The Dangerous Dogs Act 1991, the Breeding and Sale of Dogs Welfare Act 1999, both the Breeding of Dogs Act 1991 and 1973, the Microchipping of Dogs Regulations. So in England, those came into force in 2015, and in Scotland and Wales, 2016. The Pet Travel Scheme, and that focuses on pet passports. To make you aware, at this point in time in early 2019, we do not yet know the impact of Brexit or potentially a no deal and how that could affect the Pet Travel Scheme as it stands at the moment. So please be very aware of changes to that over the upcoming months. And DEFRA, as a website, it's a really useful source of information, as they are the government department that oversee all of that. And as a member of the veterinary team, it's important you keep yourself abreast of those changes as and when they come into force. We're also going to look at local authority bylaws concerning dog control. Just to bring to your attention here at the bottom of this slide, the words in bold. Where legislation changes during the lifespan of a qualification, it is your responsibility as the learner to ensure that you're knowledgeable upon the most recent version of legislation. That means that although ourselves at Harriet Ellis and your veterinary practice will keep you abreast of such changes, it's really important that you then make sure that you're aware of what the most up-to-date version is, any changes that come into force with that, so that you yourself are fully clued up about it. So today's lesson, we're going to have an overview of all of these different pieces of legislation. Just to bring to your attention now, you will see throughout the slides that there are links for you to click on to use to provide you with additional reading, actually also signpost you to really useful sources of knowledge such as the RCVS website, the RSPCA website, etc. So please utilise those as we go through. You will also see that there are some slides where there is a task for you to complete. It's really important that you complete those tasks and that you save them as Word documents and upload them onto your OneFile so that your assessor can look at those. The other part of our assessment criteria today is that you have an overview of each of these legislations. So within this lesson, we are going to have a look at the date the legislation came into force, the reason for it, who it applies to, and also how we can practically apply the legislation in a way that it is relevant to veterinary practice. And all of these pieces of legislation is just so that you have an awareness of how it can be applied. So the Veterinary Surgeons Act, first of all, as I've already said, this is an overarching piece of legislation that it is vital that you are aware of. So now, not only as a student, but also as you become a qualified team member, the Veterinary Surgeons Act is pivotal to our veterinary industry. It has been enforced for a long, long time. There have been amendments made to it over the years and different aspects added into it to make it more relevant to modern day veterinary industry and practice. It affects veterinary practice staff. It has been written with veterinary surgeons in mind, but also it will dictate and pick apart where we need to have an awareness of what people are allowed to do. So that not only relates to our veterinary surgeons, it relates to ourselves as students, to qualified members of the veterinary team, so your veterinary nurses. It relates to clients, farmers, etc. So it came into force in 1966. The reason for the legislation, and that is set out very clearly within it, is that it is in order to prevent unnecessary suffering occurring to animals. And the way that it seeks to do this is by thoroughly regulating those who provide veterinary care. You may or may not be aware of how regulated the veterinary industry is. Not only do veterinary surgeons and veterinary nurses need to ensure that they're adhering to the Veterinary Surgeons Act, we also need to ensure that we're adhering to our codes of conduct, and both veterinary surgeons and veterinary nurses have one of those to adhere to. They're really important to make sure that people are doing what they should be, that they've been educated and trained to do, so that ultimately animal welfare is not affected by this, that only those qualified staff to do so are carrying out a treatment. It applies to veterinary surgeons, as we've already said. And then within the Act itself, there is an aspect that we call Schedule 3, and that sets out what non-veterinary surgeons can provide in relation to animal treatment. This covers the remit and responsibilities of veterinary nurses, students, and it also sets out what can be provided by owners of pets and farm animals, and also who is allowed to legally perform first aid on animals. And there may be parts to this that you may think can only be carried out by qualified staff. However, in some situations, actually, as a veterinary nurse, we can do no more than members of the public. So I really would recommend you having a look into this further. And as I said on the previous slide, there is a link at the bottom of the page for you to access. So practically applying this legislation, making it applicable to veterinary practice, it dictates who can actually perform veterinary surgery. When we're talking about veterinary surgery, we can be talking about routine neutering, dental treatment and surgery, emergency surgery, just to name a few really. And you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the sorts of surgeries your practice is carrying out. Within there, and linking again to the purpose of Schedule 3, is the remit of what qualified veterinary nurses or RVNs are allowed to do. It may be that in your veterinary practice, no Schedule 3 procedures are performed by veterinary nurses, or it may be that in your veterinary practice, a vast amount of procedures are carried out under Schedule 3 by your veterinary nursing team. However, that is ultimately to be decided upon in each practice as to what a practice wants in relation to surgery, and also the training, the level of qualification and the experience of that nursing team as to whether it is appropriate. Nurses can perform minor surgeries such as stitch-ups, small lump removals, etc. They cannot, however, and are not allowed, although this has changed over the years, to enter a body cavity. So nurses cannot perform routine castration of cats. They cannot enter a body cavity such as the abdomen, unless they are assisting a veterinary surgeon in order to do so and assist. They cannot do it upon their own jurisdiction. It's vital that this legislation must be adhered to ensure that only those that are appropriately qualified to do so carry out treatment and or surgery of animals and that is in order to prevent any unnecessary suffering occurring. The Animal Welfare Act 2006. So the updated piece of legislation or act that came into force in 2006 came about because, unfortunately, prior to that, we would term animal welfare and legislation surrounding it as being reactive. And what we mean in relation to reactive is that we can actually only take action once an animal had suffered unnecessarily. And as you are very aware, that just is not appropriate. So it's trying to encompass all areas of animal care and support so that that doesn't become an issue. So it came into force in 2006. And the thinking behind it is that it's introduced an important and new concept for pet owners and carers, or those that are responsible for domestic animals, such as breeders, working animals, or farm animals. And this encompasses animals in England and Wales. So who does it apply to? Well, in section 9 of the Act, what it does is it places a duty of care on people. These people that we're talking about are pet owners, farmers, breeders, owners of boarding, such as kennelling and cattery establishments, rescue centres, veterinary practice, just to name a few. So by placing that duty of care onto people in those sorts of environments, the purpose is to ensure that they then take reasonable steps in all circumstances to meet the welfare needs of their animals to the extent that is required by good practice. The aim of the Act is ultimately to ensure that animal welfare is upheld in order to prevent an animal from suffering. What that also means now is that because we're now not being reactive to an animal suffering unnecessarily, we're being preventative in our ways of looking at and dealing with animal welfare. It means that enforcement agencies such as the RSPCA and their inspectors, for example, can now act before this sort of thing happens. They can advise and educate owners and support them. And the purpose of this is to do so before that animal starts to suffer. If this advice then is not followed through or not taken on board and the animal's needs aren't being met, then action can be taken, whether through a formal warning and in some cases prosecution. The RSPCA website is a really useful tool for finding out more about the Animal Welfare Act, the changes that came on board in 2006. So please utilise that. I have provided that as a link for you on the next page. So when we're talking about people who are responsible for the care of animals, whether that be owners or carers, they must ensure that welfare needs are met, and in particular must provide for the 5 animal welfare needs. We did used to call these 5 freedoms. They're no longer called the 5 freedoms as of the 2006 Act coming into force. So please also ensure that you're using up-to-date literature if you are looking further into this. And again, the reason for providing a link for you is that is up to date. So these 5 welfare needs that need to be encompassed and carried out are the need for the animal to have a suitable environment. That is a suitable environment for their species, size, breed, sex, just to name a few. Not just, well, that's what I've done because I've always done it. The need for a suitable diet, making sure that, again, that diet is species, breed, size specific, and also that if the animal does have any dietary or medical reasons for having a particular diet, that those are adhered to as well. The need to be able to exhibit normal behaviour patterns. Again, we are talking about normal behaviour patterns for that species, not just what we think are normal behaviour patterns, and they're things such as daytime behaviours, nighttime behaviours, normal exercise behaviours, just to name a few. The need to be housed with or apart from other animals. Some animals are social, so wish to be housed with other animals. Others are more isolated and would not wish to be housed with other animals, particularly specific species. Again, consideration of the species or breeds of animals that we are dealing with. Is it appropriate to house animals of a different species together? It may be that you are familiar with, over the years gone by, rabbits and guinea pigs being housed together. However, that isn't great for either of those animals and actually can be counterproductive and cause health issues. The need to be protected from pain, suffering, injury and disease. Now, ultimately, what this is then doing is by saying these are the 5 welfare needs that you as an animal owner, carer, somebody with that responsibility, that duty of care placed on them, is that they must have the correct knowledge of the species of animal that they are caring for. If they don't have that, then they can't possibly provide the above 5 needs correctly. So that means that, again, a person needs to educate themselves on those needs in order to be able to provide them properly. As a member of the veterinary team, you can assist with advising, education, pinpointing these people to websites such as the link that I've provided below, so that they've got correct sources of information to be able to carry these things out correctly. It applies to ourselves as the veterinary team. We have a duty of care. Ultimately, that duty of care lies with the responsible veterinary surgeon. So that veterinary surgeon is responsible for the animal's care, whether that be in the consultation room, when they've hospitalised that animal, when they've admitted that animal for surgery. But you, as a member of the veterinary team, will also be encompassed by that duty of care. We also need to be aware of duty of care when it comes to cases of neglect or mistreatment. So it might be that a veterinary surgeon encounters this in the veterinary practice or during a home visit, or is made aware of such a situation. And veterinary surgeons may be involved in court cases in these sorts of situations. For further information about the Animal Welfare Act, please visit the link provided below to the RSPCA website. There are vast amounts of information that you can access there. There's lots of information and printouts, educational training aids about the 5 animal welfare needs. And also, this is a really useful tool to be aware of in relation to finding out information about specific species. And it's something that we could signpost owners to if they wanted to know more about a species that they're planning on taking on board, or improving accommodation, etc. The Dangerous Dogs Act 1991. That was when it came into force. You may be very aware with this piece of legislation, and actually may be aware of the fact that, unfortunately, it is a piece of controversial legislation, and it is something that, whatever the reason behind it, i.e. being intended to keep members of the public safe from dogs and dog attacks, that maybe actually at this point in time, we unfortunately see a negative side of this piece of legislation because of how it works and what it's based upon. So within Section 1 of the Dangerous Dogs Act, we actually have 4 types of dogs that are identified. They are as follows: the Pit Bull Terrier, the Japanese Tosa, the Doggo Argentino, and the Fila Brasileiro. Now, what the Act does is it makes it illegal to own, sell, breed, give away or abandon one of these types of dogs. We term these as the banned breeds. It applies to owners. It places responsibility with them. Depending on the breed of animal that person owns, it may actually be necessary for them to register their dog. The Act, as stated, is intended to keep the public safe from dog attacks. However, it does remain one of the UK's most controversial pieces of legislation. A banned breed is based upon what it looks like, and this is where we have the issue, particularly in relation to that of the Pit Bull Terrier. If an owner has a dog which has many characteristics, i.e. looks like a Pit Bull Terrier, it may be considered a banned type. And what this can mean is that that dog is taken from that person, and in some situations that the dog is destroyed based upon what it looks like. And this is why it is such a controversial piece of legislation. It's really important that the owner of the dog must ensure that the dog is kept under control at all times, and this can include muzzling the dog when in public areas, etc. But ultimately, it makes it the responsibility of that dog owner to do so, to ensure that the dog is kept under control and is adhering to the piece of legislation. Veterinary practice may need to take care to ensure ownership or being the keeper of the dog is very clear, and also take care when dealing with an animal that may not be legally construed as dangerous, that may be legally construed as dangerous, but which the owner may not treat in that manner. So again, advising and educating owners. Breeding and Sale of Dogs Welfare Act 1999, the Breeding of Dogs Act 1991, and the Breeding of Dogs Act 1973. So the Breeding and Sale of Dogs Welfare Act 1999 amended and extended the provisions of the Breeding of Dogs Act 73 and also the Breeding of Dogs Act 91. And ultimately, it was already in place, but just updated and amended to provide protection for dogs used in breeding establishments. So any person who keeps a breeding establishment for dogs at any premises and carries out on those premises the business of breeding dogs for sale must obtain a licence from the local council. Please note there are differences here. So we may also have people that we would call so-called hobby breeders. So they might not be in the business of breeding dogs for sale. And how we can differ between that is that they would produce less than 5 litters in any period of 12 months. And if they produce less than 5 litters in any period of 12 months, they do not need a licence. It is up to the local discretion, to the local council to have the discretion whether to grant a licence to a breeding establishment in order for them to carry out that business. But before doing so, they must ensure that the person responsible ensures the following: that animals are provided with suitable accommodation, food, water and bedding material. This is where we have a link across here to the Animal Welfare Act again. That they're adequately exercised and visited at suitable intervals. That all reasonable precautions are taken to prevent and control the spread of diseases amongst dogs. And local councils are responsible for enforcing the legislation. So they will continue to visit that premises to make sure that this breeding establishment is doing what they should be doing at all times. In addition to ensuring those things on the previous slide, the law actually also places limits on the frequency and timing of breeding from a bitch. So they cannot be mated before they are 1 year old, because ultimately they're still a puppy themselves. And depending on the breed of dog, depends at what point we would class them as an adult. We must have no more than 6 litters from that bitch in their lifetime, and can only have 1 litter every 12 months. Breeding records must be kept to ensure that the requirements are adhered to, and that puppies that are produced at these licensed breeding establishments can only be sold at those premises or licensed pet shop. You now have a task. Using the following link to assist you, I would like you to read up and make some notes on the changes to the 2006 Animal Welfare Act, which relate to the breeding of puppies. I've provided some links there for you so that you can look into that further, and also an article about puppy farming. You probably are very aware from the news, from your time in veterinary practice, that the UK has had a really severe issue with puppy farming over recent years. And the reason for these changes is so that we've got some stronger legislation support and controls to actually penalise people that are not doing what they should be doing. Puppy farming is a very serious issue, and it is something that needs to be got on top of very quickly. We have puppies that are being brought in from different areas of the country that are being bred in puppy farms. So those puppy farms do not adhere to the criteria that we have just talked about, which ultimately means that we have unnecessary suffering and total contempt of welfare needs in relation to not only the bitch, but also puppies that are produced. It has, and you may be aware of this already, has always been said that it's really important to go to the home of the breed that you're purchasing your puppy from, or the breeding establishment, to see puppy in their natural surroundings, to see puppy with mom, and if at all possible, to see puppy with dad. However, it's become increasingly common for people actually to meet somebody in a lay-by or a supermarket car park and pay for a puppy there and there and take it home with them, having not seen the accommodation, the parents, and the sort of background that puppy has had. And unfortunately, that does mean that sometimes people are buying ultimately what are very, very poorly puppies, and puppies that have not been, produced in the correct manner. So please use those links to complete that task to assist you. Microchipping of dogs regulations, and this is important to be aware of, that we have both England, Scotland and Wales here. So the regulations came into force in England in 2015 and the others in 2016. So ultimately, from the 6th of April 2015, and the actual legislation came into force in 2015 with this timescale set of the 6th of April the following year. And the reason for that timescale was to ensure that there was plentiful time for all dogs alive prior to that point who didn't have a microchip to have a microchip, and that then any puppies produced after the 6th of April 2016 required a microchip as a puppy. It is a legal requirement for this to be done, and it's been brought about in order to improve dog welfare, as hopefully the purpose of microchipping will allow for dog owners to be traced. However, you may be familiar in practice with situations where people have not updated their details, such as telephone number, home address, email address. Ultimately, there's two parts to the whole aspect of adhering to legislation. The owner must make sure that they have their dog microchipped, but they must also make sure that their details are kept up to date. The purpose of which being that we can return those animals quicker to their owners. Track the owners down and get them back home. But also, if we do have situations where people have been attacked by a dog, that we can trace those animals. What I'd like you to do, again, is to carry out a task, and you can use the link provided for you. I'd like you to use that link to make notes regarding timescales and potential penalties that are in place if people do not microchip their dogs. I would then also like for you to look into how your practice complies with the above legislation in relation to microchipping of puppies. So what's your procedure? Is it at the time of first vaccination, at second vaccination? How does your practice go about ensuring that that legislation is being adhered to? Pet travel scheme. Before I go through the details within this slide, as already mentioned, this is a piece of legislation that you need to be aware of. It's very pivotal in 2019 that there is potentially changes to this that you will need to be aware of. At the moment, the time frame that we have set in place is by the 29th of March of 2019. We're in early 2019 at the moment. We do not have any changes to that date. This may change, however, but what is ultimately important for yourself will be that you keep yourself abreast of the changes to this. Harriet Ellis will provide you with any updates as and when they come along, as an announcement on your one file, but also you'll hear about this sort of thing in your veterinary practice as well. Also, the DEFRA website is a really good source of information about this. They are a government department that oversee the pet travel scheme. So please keep yourself, abreast of those changes with their website. Okay. So pet travel scheme overall requires various aspects or criteria to be adhered to, and this is to enable safe travel, but then also safe return of animals to the UK. Now, people can only enter the UK or actually return to the UK as it stands at the moment with their pet dog, cat or ferret if they have done the following. The pet has been microchipped. The pet has a pet passport or a third country official veterinary certificate. The animal has been vaccinated against rabies, and depending what country the animal is coming from, it may also need a blood test if they are travelling from what we term an unlisted country. Dogs must also usually have a tapeworm treatment as well. If these pieces of criteria are not met, then the animal may be put into quarantine for up to 4 months, because ultimately then the rules have not been followed, and that is the penalty for doing so. Or if the animal is to return to the UK or be brought into the UK via sea, they might be refused entry at that point there and then. The animal owner is responsible for any fees or charges incurred in this situation. Local authority bylaws concerning dog control and fouling. Local authority councils have bylaws which the public need to adhere to in order to be what we call responsible pet owners, which is obviously really important in all areas of pet ownership. One of the aspects that this covers is dog fouling. So if a dog is allowed to foul in a public place, then the person responsible for walking that animal at that time could be given an on-the-spot fine. It is very easy to make sure that you go out on your dog walk with dog poo collection devices, such as bags. So it really isn't an excuse. And that is why these penalties are being given out. Now, the amount will vary from council to council, and there are pieces of information, in relation to waste disposal bins, etc., that actually detail, and signage that detail to members of the public what the fine could be. So they're generally around £50, but they can be as much as an £80 on the spot fine. And if that person actually refuses to pay the fine, they can be taken to court and fined up to £1,000. The purpose for this is in order to keep the public and especially children safe from the harmful parasites that feces can harbour. Over your time during your training, you will learn about in more detail about the parasites that we need to be aware of in faecal matter. Ultimately, there are parasites that can make members of the public very poorly, particularly children, especially falling over in an area where a dog has been allowed to foul, and then may make contact with their eyes with hands that have been contaminated with faeces. And there is the potential for actually that child to suffer from blindness. Also, if any of that harmful faecal matter were to be ingested as well, that can make people very poorly too. So it is ultimately to protect public and especially children. Dog control. This relates to any dog that appears to be a stray, and it must be reported to the local council. The local council will have a dog warden who will collect the dog and take it to the kennel establishment that they use in order for the animal to be collected by the owner. Reporting of a dangerous dog. You can report that to the council dog warden as well. So just in summary, I would just like to review the fact that we have, within this lesson, looked at all relevant pieces of legislation as set out to you in your qualification handbook. Please, as the bold sentence says at the bottom of this slide, make sure that if there are any changes that you're keeping yourself abreast of those changes. But we will, as a centre, provide you with any updates such as that via announcements on your OneFile. There is also an e-portfolio task that relates to this learning outcome and the criteria within it. So hopefully this has given you the basic understanding that you need to have in place, or built upon any understanding that you had previously. And hopefully the links that have been provided will provide you with further resources and also further reading if you wish to do any further in order for you to be able to complete your e-portfolio task on this. If you have any questions at all, please contact your veterinary assessor. Thank you.